In September of 1918, a charge d'affaires from Switzerland named Frederick Oderlin walked into the office of United States Secretary of State Robert Lansing carrying a cablegram from Berlin. The German government wanted a weapon banned from the war. Not a machine gun. Not a flamethrower. Not the gas that had already blinded a generation of young men in the trenches west of Amiens. A shotgun. A pump-action shotgun built by a company in New Haven, Connecticut, carried by American soldiers who had never studied the Hague Convention and had no idea their weapon was, at that very moment, being called a war crime. Germany said the shotgun caused unnecessary suffering under the laws of war and threatened to execute any American soldier caught carrying one. That is the injustice sitting at the center of this story, though not the one you think. The gun survived. America refused to take it out of the fight then, or for the rest of the century. The man who designed the mechanism inside it had already sold the rights to it. For a flat payment, years before a single American doughboy ever pumped a shell into a German trench. Most stories about a weapon becoming a legend end with the company getting richer while the world forgets who built it. This one does not skip that part. It sits inside it. You have probably heard the phrase war crime attached to some piece of American hardware before, usually with a wink, as a joke about how effective a tool turned out to be in the hands of a soldier who knew how to use it. Attach that same phrase to a formal diplomatic protest between two governments still burying their dead, and it stops sounding like a joke. Somewhere underneath that accusation stands a man who never got to weigh in on either side of it. Because by the time it happened, he no longer held any financial stake in the outcome at all. Ogden, Utah, 1868. A boy of 13 is already working full days in his father's gun shop, the way family accounts of the Browning household describe him doing since he was old enough to hold a file steady. Jonathan Browning had brought his trade west with the Mormon settlers and built a name for himself as a frontier gunsmith, and his son grew up inside the smell of gun oil and the sound of steel being shaped by hand, one repair and one custom order at a time. That year, the boy finished his first complete firearm, built almost entirely from stock and parts already on hand in the shop. The kind of project a grown journeyman would have been proud to sign. Nobody wrote down what his father said about it. What survives is simpler and harder to argue with. A boy who could build a working gun at 13 did not stop building them. John Moses Browning would spend the rest of his working life solving problems other gun makers had given up on, for companies that never once asked what the solving had cost him. By his 20s, Browning had a shop of his own and more working patents than most men twice his age, and none of it came from theory. He tested ideas at the bench. He tested them again in the field. Short sentences describe the results better than long ones. A rifle that jammed got rebuilt that night. A shotgun that kicked too hard got redesigned by morning. At 28 years old, he sold Winchester repeating arms, a single-shot rifle design that would become one of the most reliable actions the company ever built, and Thomas Bennett, Winchester's general manager, understood what he was looking at. Neither man questioned the arrangement they were building together. Browning sold. Winchester bought outright. No royalty, no ongoing share, nothing tied to how many units left the loading dock. So Browning kept designing. Ogden, Utah, 1893. Browning is working the mechanism for a new kind of shotgun, one that loads by pulling a sliding handle back and forward instead of breaking the action open by hand. It takes months of patient reworking, the locking bolt refitted and tested and refitted again, before the action runs clean through a full magazine without a single failure to feed. This becomes, 4 years later, the Winchester Model 1897, a solid frame pump gun chambered for 12-gauge shells, and it does something no shotgun before it managed to do reliably. Hold the trigger down while working the pump, and the gun fires on every single stroke of the action. with no disconnector to stop it. Gunsmiths call this a design flaw in anything else. In this gun, it becomes the entire point. Winchester bought the design the same way they had bought every design before it. A flat sum, paid once, patent assigned outright to the company, Browning's name attached to the paperwork, and nowhere else. That is how a jobber for a rifle company got paid in that era. Not in royalties tied to units sold. In a lump payment handed over before the gun ever left the workshop floor, an arrangement both men considered fair at the time it was made. Nobody in that room in 1893 could have told you the gun would still be selling in 1957. Nobody could have told you it would end up in the mud outside Belleau Wood, in the hands of scouts moving ahead of the American line, doing work neither man had designed it for. There is one more figure worth holding on to before this story moves forward, and it will not make sense until later. 25,000. Keep that number in the back of your mind while the story crosses an ocean, because it is the number that turns a shop in Ogden into a diplomatic incident in Washington. First, the gun has to prove itself in a market nobody has invented yet. Sold to hunters and trappers and messengers who never once thought about trenches. New Haven, Connecticut, 1917. America has entered the war in Europe, and the Ordnance Department needs weapons for a kind of fighting nobody had trained American soldiers for. Trenches. Close range. Enemy positions cleared room by room, sometimes yard by yard, in tunnels barely wide enough for two men to pass. Winchester takes the standard Model 1897 off the shelf and modifies it for the job. A perforated steel shield fitted over the barrel so a soldier's hand does not burn on hot metal during rapid fire. A bayonet lug added below the muzzle so the gun doubles as a spear when the shells run out. Sling swivels for carry. The army orders these by the thousand. A private from a farm town somewhere between the Ohio River and the Great Lakes is handed one of these guns before he ever reaches France. He has fired a shotgun before, at rabbits and at nothing in particular, behind his father's barn. But never one built like this. His officer explains the trick in under a minute. Hold the trigger, work the pump as fast as your arms will move. The gun does not stop firing until the magazine is empty. 9 pellets of buckshot per shell, 5 shells in the tube, 1 more racked into the chamber. He does not know the man who designed the mechanism in his hands. He does not know Browning's name at all. He only knows that in the confined dark of a German trench, this gun does something no rifle in his platoon can do, and that knowledge will keep him alive more than once before the war ends. Winchester delivered roughly 25,000 of these guns to the Ordnance Department before the armistice, the majority in trench configuration. The rest converted from existing sporting stock. 50 guns per division, most of them handed to scouting units, the men who make first contact with the enemy in the dark. American troops start calling it the trench broom. Some call it the trench sweeper. One newspaper editor covering the war for a national sports syndicate goes further, crediting the weapon in print as America's greatest contribution to the war, and never once mentions who built the mechanism that made it possible. Here is the withholding part of this story, the part that takes explaining before it can be delivered properly. On the 19th of September, 1918, the Swiss legation representing German interests handed Secretary Lansing a formal protest. The wording is careful, and it is also a threat dressed as a legal argument. Citing Article 23 of the Hague Convention's Annex on the Customs of War, the clause forbidding weapons calculated to cause unnecessary suffering. Any American prisoner found carrying a shotgun or its ammunition, the note says, forfeits his life under the laws of war. This is not a rumor passed along by soldiers in a mess line. This is an official diplomatic communication between two governments still fighting a war that has already killed millions of men with weapons far worse than buckshot. Lansing does not sit on it. Together with the Army's Judge Advocate General, he reviews the claim and rejects it within weeks, arguing the shotgun is no more brutal than the shrapnel shells and machine guns already accepted on both sides of the line, and pointing out, not gently, that the nation lodging this complaint had already used flamethrowers and chlorine gas against troops with no defense against either. General Pershing adds his own answer in the field. Any German soldier captured carrying a flamethrower or a saw-backed bayonet will be treated the same way Germany has threatened to treat Americans found with a shotgun. Nobody is executed. The war ended less than 2 months later. But for those weeks in the fall of 1918, a gun built from a design Browning sold for a flat fee 2 decades earlier is the subject of formal protest between 2 warring nations, argued over by cabinet secretaries, and John Moses Browning is not in the room for any of it. He is in Hartford that same year, a short train ride from where the protest is being debated, supervising production of a different weapon entirely. The Browning automatic rifle. A water-cooled machine gun capable of firing for the better part of an hour without stopping. The government purchased production rights to those designs, along with the Colt Model 1911 pistol, for a sum in the hundreds of thousands, real money Browning saw. But that contract covers different guns. The shotgun making headlines that same autumn, the one Germany is calling a war crime, belongs entirely to Winchester now. Browning reads the same newspapers everyone else reads. He sees his own mechanism, the one he spent months perfecting on a bench in Ogden a quarter century earlier, called America's greatest contribution to the war, and his name appears in none of it. He does not write a letter to the papers correcting the record. He goes back to the machine gun. What Browning received from the shotgun's wartime service amounts to what his original contract specified in 1893, which is to say nothing further at all. No renegotiated patent, no royalty clause triggered by government purchase orders. No back payment for the 25,000 units the Ordnance Department bought during the war, no share of what a diplomatic incident does for a weapon's reputation and its sales for the next 4 decades, no check. The culture Browning worked inside understood the inventor's job as finished the moment the check for the flat fee cleared. Everything the gun did after that, on any battlefield, under any flag, belonged to the company whose name was stamped into the receiver. America's answer to Germany in 1918 was not the last time the country had to decide what to do with this particular shotgun. It came up again after the war, when police departments and the messengers of the American Express Company adopted stripped-down civilian versions for the close-range work the trenches had proven it could do. It came up again in the 1940s, when the Marine Corps and the Army pulled the design back into service for a Second World War, still slam-firing, still carrying 6 rounds ready. A full generation after a foreign government had tried to have it declared illegal. Accounts from later conflicts describe the same gun, or its direct descendants, still being issued and still being carried decades on, though the specific units and numbers from that later period are harder to pin down than the well-documented 1918 procurement figures. Whatever the count, the pattern holds. Every time the question came back around, America kept the gun. Winchester kept the Model 1897 in continuous production from 1897 until 1957, 6 full decades, more than 1 million units built across every grade from the plainest riot configuration to the checkered wood of the tournament grade. Winchester got rich off a gun that started a diplomatic incident. Browning got a flat fee, paid before the design ever proved itself in any of it. Ask what happened to the man himself, and the answer takes a moment to arrive. Because Browning did not stop working long enough to leave much of a trail beyond the patents. He had already left Winchester for good back in 1902, walking away after the company refused to pay him a royalty on a new self-loading shotgun design, taking that gun instead to a factory in Belgium willing to pay him the way he had wanted to be paid all along. He kept designing for Colt, for the United States government, for Fabrique Nationale, for 3 more decades after the war that made his shotgun famous, without ever paying him for it. On the 26th of November, 1926, in Herstal, Belgium, he died of heart failure at his workbench at the age of 71. The pistol he had been working on that morning sat unfinished. Another engineer would complete it 9 years later. He never went back to New Haven. You already know which side of that arrangement sounds fair on paper, and which side sounds fair only after the fact. In 1893, neither man could see 40 years into the future. By 1918, one of them was reading about his own invention in the newspaper like everyone else in the country. That reliability was never a mystery, whatever conflict the gun turned up in next. It was a decision made on a workbench in Ogden by a man who refused to ship Winchester anything less than an action that fed every single time. A closet in a house somewhere in America holds a pump-action shotgun today, bought the year after a break in 2 streets over, never fired at another human being, kept loaded and racked by the door for a night that has not come yet, and the owner hopes never will. That gun's action, the twin bars sliding the bolt forward and locking it before the trigger can move, descends in a direct line from patent number 440-1390, filed under Browning's name in 1893. That patent traces back to a bench in Ogden where a young gunsmith reworked a locking mechanism until it stopped failing. That bench traces back to a boy who finished his first working firearm at 13 years old and never really stopped. The promise inside that closet shotgun, the promise that it will work once when it is needed, was written into the mechanism before the man who wrote it ever saw a dollar from a war it would later fight in. At a gun show table somewhere in the Midwest, 2 men are standing over a display case, holding an original trench configuration model 1897. The perforated heat shield still intact, the bayonet lug still fitted for a blade neither of them owns. One of them has collected Winchesters his whole life, and speaks about the company the way other men speak about their college football team, with real loyalty, the kind that does not require facts to sustain it. The other has read enough patent history to know whose bolt design is locking that action closed, and he says so, quietly, without much hope of changing anyone's mind at a folding table under fluorescent lights. Neither man knew Browning personally. Neither man was alive when the Swiss legation walked into Lansing's office. Both of them, without quite realizing it, are arguing about a name that stopped being paid for this gun before either of their fathers was born. Both men will pay full collector's price before the afternoon ends. One of them for the gun itself, the other for a lesser example missing its bayonet lug, and both payments go to the seller behind the table, a private dealer. Not to Winchester directly anymore, though the name on the receiver is still doing the work it was built to do nearly a century ago. Browning gets none of that money either. He never did. Ask yourself honestly whether the name stamped into the steel would have changed what either collector was willing to pay for the privilege of owning a piece of a war Germany once tried to legislate out of existence. The box on the shelf still says Winchester. The patent underneath the receiver says John M. Browning, filed in 1893. The same design a German government would later call a violation of the customs of war and an American government would refuse to abandon. Browning, his name is stamped nowhere a customer at the counter would ever think to look.